She had been running for 2 years and 7 months. And she stopped on a Tuesday, on a cliff above a valley in the outer provinces, with the morning light coming in low and gold across the dead grass, and both hands pressed flat against a document she had spent all night reading by archive lamplight until her eyes ached, and the words had rearranged themselves into the shape of something she could not unknow. Below the cliff, in the valley's green floor, the king's search parties moved like small purposeful shadows, closer than they had ever been. Close enough that she could see the royal colors on the lead rider's coat. Close enough that 2 years and 7 months of careful, practiced, methodical running could have ended in the next 20 minutes if she had wanted it to. She did not run. She stood at the cliff's edge with the document in her hands and her right palm pressed to the birthmark beneath her left collarbone, the mark she had carried since birth, hidden under fabric for 23 years. Never understood until last night, and she made a decision. Not because they had found her. Because she had finally found herself. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story has traveled, because this story deserves to reach everywhere. The town of Vedris smelled of turned soil and river water, which Isara had come to understand as the smell of a community that was still working, still trying, still planting, still asking the land for what it could give despite everything the crown's neglect had cost it over the previous decade. She had been in Vedris for 3 months, which was the longest she had stayed anywhere since leaving the capital. And she had stayed because the land here had a specific quality she could feel through her feet when she walked the outer fields in the early morning before the town woke, a deep, patient fertility being poorly managed. Underground water running in directions the surface work had not accounted for. A potential that the community could not see because no one had taught them to look for it in the right direction. She had taught herself to look at 14. She had never fully understood why she could feel what the land felt. She had attributed it to sensitivity, a word her parents had used with the specific resignation of people describing a trait they could not correct and had given up trying to encourage, and had learned over the years to use it practically rather than philosophically. She assessed soil. She found underground water. She walked the boundaries of contested fields and described the composition changes that made the legal arguments unnecessary. She told farming communities where to plant and what the land needed in exchange for what they were asking from it. She charged what people could afford, which was sometimes very little, and she moved on before anyone could ask the questions that required answers she did not have. Her cover in each new location was the same, an agricultural assessor, independent. Traveling through the outer provinces doing work the crown's official advisors were too few and too expensive for the communities that needed them most. This was entirely true, which made it an excellent cover. The false name she had used for the first year, she had abandoned in the second. She had found, practically, that the most invisible identity was simply a true identity presented without context. She was Isara. She assessed land. She moved on. The birthmark beneath her left collarbone she covered without thinking. She had been covering it since she was old enough to understand that visible differences on an Omega's body invited scrutiny she could not afford. It was a precise pattern, a star inside a circle, geometric and deliberate, in deep indigo against her skin, and she had never found a satisfying explanation for it except that she had been born with it. It was hers, and the less attention it drew the better. She had occasionally wondered about it in the way she occasionally wondered about the land reading, with the contained, patient curiosity of someone who had too many immediate practical concerns to pursue a question that had no immediate practical application. The wondering had become less contained in the past year. She had begun asking questions, carefully, indirectly. In the natural course of conversations about regional history, in every provincial archive and community library she had passed through. What did the founding sovereign's seal look like? What was the documented appearance of the founding bloodline's hereditary mark? What had happened to the founding bloodline's lineage 3 generations ago? She asked these questions in the tone of someone with a general scholarly interest in constitutional history, which was a tone she had practiced until it was entirely convincing. None of the archives outside the capital had the full picture. She had been assembling fragments. In Vedris, the provincial archivist was a man named Mend, sharp, generous with information. and possessed of the specific delight of someone who had spent 30 years maintaining a collection of documents that almost no one ever asked to read. He had been pleased to find in Isara someone who asked to read everything. Over 3 months of professional acquaintance, he had brought her progressively deeper into the archive's holdings as payment for the agricultural assessments she completed for the regional communities. On a Wednesday evening, 3 months into her stay, he brought her a key to the restricted collection. He said, "Founding era texts, regional histories, the original constitutional documents. Whatever interests you." He said it with the offhand generosity of someone who did not know he was handing her the answer to a question she had been carrying for 23 years. She had thanked him with the appropriate measure of scholarly enthusiasm and had gone to the archive that night. The first document in the restricted collection bore, on its opening page, the founding sovereign's seal. A star inside a circle, precisely geometric, in deep indigo ink. Her hand went to her collarbone before she had consciously processed why. She sat down at the archive table and pulled the lamp closer and began to read with the specific, accelerating attention of someone who has been looking for something for a long time and has just recognized its shape. She did not sleep that night. By morning she knew. She read through the night without stopping, and the archive lamp burned down twice. And she refilled it without looking away from the documents because she was afraid that looking away would break something, some quality of concentrated understanding she had never had access to before and might not find again if she lost the thread. The Sovereign's Covenant was not difficult to read. This was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected founding-era legal language to be the kind of dense, deliberately obfuscated text that institutional power typically used to make its own foundations inaccessible to the people those foundations governed. Instead, it was plain, specific, written in the voice of someone who had believed, at a foundational level, that a law which could not be understood by the people it was meant to protect was not a law, but a cage with better decoration. The birthmark documented in full, the star and circle pattern, the position beneath the left collarbone, the color, deep indigo, permanent from birth, the size, every particular matching the mark she had been covering for 23 years. The covenant described it as the founding bloodline's sovereignty mark, the physical expression of a constitutional authority that predated and superseded every subsequent legal structure in the kingdom. The mark-bearer held sovereign authority above all other claims, above the Alpha King's hereditary title, above the Constitutional Council, above every court ruling, every administrative amendment, every layer of institutional structure that had been built in the 200 years since the founding sovereign set her seal to the covenant's first page. She read this provision 3 times. Then she set the document down on the archive table, pressed both palms flat against its surface, and breathed carefully for approximately 2 minutes. Then she picked it up and kept reading. The land-reading gift, documented explicitly in the covenant's foundational preamble, and again in the governance philosophy section. The founding sovereign had governed by genuine connection to the territory she administered, a felt sense of the land's condition that was not metaphorical but physical and precise, as documented in the first sovereign's personal governance records, which Isara found in the 3rd document she pulled from the restricted collection. The records described exactly what she had been feeling since she was 14 years old. The land's water table readable through the soles of her feet, the soil's composition and condition transmitting through her palms, the emotional state of communities detectable in the territory they occupied through a quality of resonance she had never had adequate language for. The founding sovereign had called it land truth. The covenant called it the mark-bearer's primary governance instrument. She had not been sensitive. She had been sovereign. She had been walking other people's failing fields for 23 years, finding their underground water and assessing their soil composition and telling them where to plant. And every one of those things had been the founding bloodline's governance function expressing itself in the only context available to it, the outer provinces. The communities the crown's official structure did not serve adequately. The people who needed what she could give and could not access it through the systems designed to withhold it. The history of the bloodline's disappearance took her until the 4th document and the lamp's second refilling to fully understand. 3 generations ago, a succession dispute between 2 branches of the court's hereditary structure. The founding bloodline's last formally acknowledged heir had presented a constitutional challenge to the succession under the Covenant's authority provisions, which had been legally sound and politically inconvenient, and had been addressed not through legal argument, which could not succeed against the Covenant's own language, but through the practical suppression of the archive records that would have allowed the bloodline to be traced through subsequent generations. The heir had survived, had been sent into the outer provinces, had built a quiet life, had children, grandchildren, a great-granddaughter. The lineage ran 4 clean generations to a woman currently sitting in the Vedris Provincial Archive. At 4 in the morning with both hands pressed to a founding document and the specific internal condition of someone whose entire self-understanding had just been replaced with something larger and more consequential than anything she had been prepared for. She set the documents in order on the table. She pressed her right hand to the mark beneath her collarbone. The land beneath the archive building responded, a faint warmth moving up through the stone foundation, barely perceptible, like the first vibration of an instrument string after years of being unplayed. She thought about her village, the water rights petition, the stream that had been further diverted in the years since she left, the 30% reduction in the farming capacity of people who had sent her to the capital with, for months of careful preparation, entrusted her to bring something back. She thought about 30 seconds in a petition chamber, and what 30 seconds had cost her, and everyone she had prepared those 30 seconds on behalf of. She thought about 2.5 years of moving through the outer territories, sleeping in lodging houses, covering a mark she had never understood, working the land that had always been trying to tell her something she had not had the framework to receive. She made the decision with the specific clarity of someone who has spent a long time in motion and has just found the ground solid enough to stand on. She was going to stop running. Not because the king's search parties had found her. Not for him, not for the court. Not for the recognition of any system that had spent 23 years declining to look at what was directly in front of it. Because she had been running from something that was always hers. And she was finished. She spent the remaining hours before dawn reading every word of the Sovereign's covenant a second time, taking careful notes in the margins of her field journal, and preparing for a conversation she had been unknowingly preparing for her entire life. 2.5 years earlier, she had believed that preparation was sufficient protection against outcome. She had been wrong about this in the specific way that people were wrong about things they had not yet had direct evidence to contradict. She had grown up understanding that the world did not distribute resources or attention according to need, that the systems meant to serve people frequently served themselves instead, that an Omega petitioner in a crown session occupied a position in the hierarchy of audible voices that required significantly more preparation than an equivalent petitioner of higher rank simply to reach the same threshold of being heard. She had understood all of this and had prepared accordingly. She had believed that sufficient preparation could close the gap. The petition had taken 4 months to build. She had begun with the legal research, working through every accessible record of Crown intervention in private water rights disputes, looking for cases where the intervention had been granted, identifying the legal language that had carried those decisions. She found 3 clear precedents. She documented each one, summarized the relevant findings, identified the specific statutory language in the current water rights framework that connected the precedents to her village's situation. This took 6 weeks, and the full use of the regional archives holdings and the assistance of a retired administrator in a neighboring town who helped her understand the court's procedural language. The impact documentation took 8 weeks. She measured the stream flow herself at 7 different points, over 4 weeks of morning visits before the community's working day began. She mapped the diversion's engineering, where the water had been redirected, by what means, under what authorization. She quantified the agricultural impact in specific terms: acreage affected, yield reduction by crop type, projected cumulative loss over a 5-year period if the diversion remained in place. The land reading gift gave her accuracy that no conventional measurement tool available to her could have produced. The underground water table, the soil's moisture levels at depth, the irrigation patterns that the surface diversion had disrupted, she felt all of this through her hands and her feet and translated it into the numerical language of agricultural assessment. The formal petition language had been reviewed by the village's oldest educated resident, a retired schoolteacher named Oren, who had spent 40 years teaching children to read and write and had a precise, specific understanding of formal document construction. He had reviewed the petition twice, suggested 12 revisions, reviewed it a third time with the revisions incorporated, and told her it was as strong a petition document as he had seen in his experience of such things. She had carried it to the capital in a protective cloth wrapper under her arm for 3 weeks of travel. The public petitioner's lodging in the capital was a large room on the administrative quarters' eastern side, thin mattresses, shared washing facilities. The specific institutional smell of a space designed for function rather than comfort. The people in it were the kind of people who traveled long distances to ask for things that should not have required asking for. Farmers with water disputes and inheritance complications. Community leaders with infrastructure requests. Small business owners with regulatory problems. Families navigating the bureaucratic machinery of a system that was not designed to make their navigation easy. She had spent the evening before the session sitting in the lodging's common room listening to these people and had felt, in the specific way she felt the land's condition, the weight of what everyone in that room was carrying. The session had 23 petitions. Hers was number 17. She had sat in the gallery for the preceding 16 and had watched carefully. The king moved through the queue with the efficient authority of someone who had been processing these sessions for years and had developed a rhythm that prioritized closure over investigation. She had watched the pattern. Petitions from people arriving with legal representation received measurably more processing time. Petitions from people whose registration carried markers of social standing, guild affiliations, hereditary land notations, professional credentials, received more careful consideration. Petitions from people like her, the registration box marked with the Omega classification, no guild, no land, no professional credential beyond the agricultural knowledge she had developed through her own practice, moved through the queue faster. She had noted this and had told herself that the petition's quality would compensate, that the precedent documentation and the impact quantification and the precise legal language would carry it past the classification box's implicit weight. That preparation was sufficient protection against outcome. Her number was called. She stood at the petitioner's position and opened the formal statement, the village's name, the specific relief sought, the jurisdictional basis for the Crown's authority to act. She was perhaps 40 seconds into the statement when she became aware that King Covan, who had been reviewing the summary page of her petition document, had looked up. He said, "Petition declined. Insufficient precedent for Crown intervention in private water rights allocation. Next case." He had not read past the summary page. She would understand this 6 weeks later, when she had enough distance from the moment to examine it clearly. The summary page described the petition's subject and the petitioner's classification and the relief sought. It did not contain the precedent documentation or the impact quantification or the legal argument. Those were on the subsequent pages, which he had not turned to. She stood at the petitioner's position for 3 more seconds. She was aware, in those 3 seconds, of the gallery observing, the minor officials and waiting petitioners who occupied the session's peripheral space, whose attention had moved to her with the specific quality of an audience watching someone receive a verdict. She was aware of the clerk at the recording desk making a notation in the session log. She was aware of the king already directing his attention toward the summary page of the next petition. The 30 seconds of her case already receding in his processing into the administrative past. She did not cry. She did not protest. She did not perform distress for the gallery's observation, because what she felt in those 3 seconds was not the kind of thing that translated into performance. It was more fundamental, the specific weight of a door closing on 4 months of preparation and 3 weeks of travel and 40 years of a retired schoolteacher's careful revision and the accumulated trust of a village that had sent her as their representative and expected her to bring something back. She walked out. She kept walking. She walked out of the administrative quarter and through the capital's outer districts and through the city gates and onto the road south. And she did not stop in any meaningful sense for 2 years and 7 months. 6 months after the session, Covan's court hereditary records, researchers surfaced documentation tracing the founding bloodline's lineage through 3 generations of deliberate archival suppression to a woman in the outer provinces. The physical description in the documentation matched Isara in every particular. Covan read the report on a Tuesday morning in his private study, understood within the first reading what it implied about the session 6 months prior, and sat with the understanding for the remainder of the day before he was able to think clearly about anything else. He began the search the following morning. She was already 3 provinces east, pressing her hands into a stranger's failing field, reading the water table with the founding bloodline's oldest gift and telling a farming family where to dig. 2 years and 7 months of searching had done something to Covan that no previous experience in 20 years of governance had managed. It had introduced him, with sustained and systematic thoroughness, to the experience of failure. Not the ordinary failures of governance, the diplomatic miscalculations, the legislative compromises, the military campaigns that achieved their objectives at higher cost than projected. Those failures had always been absorbed into the ongoing machinery of institutional function, addressed through the same systems that had produced them, corrected by the same authority that had made the original decision. They had cost him something: time, resources, political capital, but they had never cost him the specific thing that 2.5 years of searching for one woman in a kingdom he theoretically controlled completely had cost him. They had never made him understand what it felt like to want something he could not simply take. He had read the Sovereign's Covenant himself in the first weeks of the search, when the hereditary records researchers' report had made its full implications unavoidable. He had read it with the systematic attention he brought to all documents that had significant governance implications, and he had understood it clearly, and he had sat with what he understood for several days before he had been able to think productively about anything else. The woman he was looking for was, under the kingdom's oldest and highest constitutional law, his sovereign. His own hereditary authority was explicitly subordinate to the founding bloodline's constitutional claim. The Sovereign's Covenant predated his family's monarchy by 60 years and had been incorporated by reference into every subsequent constitutional amendment, not superseded. Incorporated, which meant its provisions were active law rather than historical curiosity. He had dismissed her petition in 30 seconds. He had then spent 2 years and 7 months unable to find her. He did not share the constitutional detail with his full court. The official account of the search described it as a hereditary succession matter requiring the location of a specific lineage holder for documentation purposes, true in the narrow sense and deliberately incomplete in the broader one. He had not decided, at the search's commencement, exactly what he intended to do when he found her. He had known, with increasing clarity as the months passed, what he intended to say. The private reckoning he was conducting was between himself and the specific, sustained, uncomfortable experience of being comprehensively wrong about something that mattered enormously, not wrong in a way that could be corrected through administrative adjustment or diplomatic repair, but wrong in the foundational way of someone who had been operating from a flawed framework and had not known it was flawed until the framework produced a consequence he could not reverse. He had reviewed the full petition document within a week of the researcher's report. He had read every page. The precedent documentation was thorough. The legal argument was sound. The agricultural impact quantification was the kind of precise, empirically grounded analysis that his court's official advisors produced when they were working well, and it had been produced by an Omega petitioner from an outer province who had arrived at his session without representation or credential, and he had dismissed it on the summary page because the classification box had told him, in the shorthand of his own accumulated bias, that this was not a case requiring his full attention. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in a way that was entirely legible to him in retrospect and had been entirely invisible to him in the moment, which was the specific quality of systemic bias that made it most dangerous, not the bias that announced itself, but the bias that felt like accurate perception. The search had taken him to 11 provinces. He had followed intelligence reports, agricultural circuit records, community healer registries, provincial employment documents. She had been consistently 2 to 4 weeks ahead of his searchers, not because she was moving at exceptional speed, but because she moved with the specific invisibility of someone who had made herself unremarkable in the way that people who had learned early that visibility was a liability made themselves unremarkable. She did her work, charged what was affordable, left no debt and no complaint and no memorable detail beyond the quality of the agricultural assessments, which was exceptional but which was attributed to skill rather than to anything that would flag her location in a search registry. He had arrived in Vedras 3 days after her landlord had noted her name in the provincial register. A routine administrative requirement she had complied with because non-compliance would itself have been a flag. The intelligence had reached him through the provincial administrator's weekly report, which had been flagged by the search system he had established 14 months earlier. He had ridden hard. He had arrived 48 hours after the flag. The landlord told him she had settled her account that morning. The Eastern District's farming community leader told him she had completed her final assessment the previous day. The archivist men told him, with the specific discomfort of someone who did not know what he had inadvertently facilitated, that she had spent a night in the archive's restricted collection and had returned the key the following morning with a note of thanks. He had walked the outer fields. He had walked the cliff path east of the valley. He had stood on the cliff and found it empty of everything except the flat rock at its edge, on which a founding-era document had been placed beneath a small stone with the deliberateness of something left rather than forgotten. He had picked it up and found, on the last blank page, a sentence in careful handwriting. "I know what I am. I will come to you when I am ready." He read it 3 times. He read it with the quality of attention he had been practicing for 2 years and 7 months, not the speed of conclusion attention that had processed her petition summary in 30 seconds and reached a confident wrong result, but the slower, deeper attention of someone who had learned, through specific and costly experience, what insufficient attention produced. He heard the sound of someone standing in the cliff's grass behind him. He turned. She said his name. "Not Your Majesty. Not a title. Not the formal mode of address that the court's protocol assigned to interactions with the Crown, which she had used in the petition chamber 2.5 years ago in the specific, careful way of someone trying to give a system every possible reason to work the way it was supposed to work. She said his name the way a person said the name of someone they had been thinking about carefully for a long time and had decided, in the full privacy of their own reasoning, exactly how to address when the moment arrived. Covan. He turned. She was standing 20 meters up the cliff's grass slope, in the late afternoon light that came in low and golden from the west at this hour, with the outer province's open landscape behind her and the specific quality of stillness that belonged to someone who had made a deliberate choice and was not reconsidering it. She wore her work clothing, practical linen in the muted colors of someone who moved through landscapes without wanting to be noticed. The tools of her agricultural assessment trade visible in the bag over her shoulder. Her dark hair tied back in the efficient way of a person who needed their hands free. The mark at her collarbone was covered, as it always was. She looked exactly like what she had been for 2.5 years. Someone doing hard work in difficult conditions with complete competence and no expectation of acknowledgement. She also looked, Covan registered with the quality of attention he had been developing across 900 days of searching, like someone who had recently understood something significant and had not yet had to share it with anyone else. There was a specific quality of private knowledge in the way she stood, not triumph, which would have been understandable and which she did not perform, but the particular groundedness of a person who has found their footing on terrain they did not previously know they were standing on. He looked at her for a moment. She let him. He said, "You read the document." She said, "Yes." He said, "Then you know what it says." She said, "I know what all of it says. I spent the night reading it, and I have spent today thinking about what it means and what it requires." She said this without particular drama, in the tone of someone reporting the results of a process they had conducted methodically and had now completed. She said, "The water rights petition." Her voice did not change when she said this. It was not an accusation in the performed sense, not the confrontational declaration of someone seeking a specific emotional response. It was a fact. Placed between them with the same precision, she placed agricultural assessment findings before community leaders. Here is what the evidence shows, here is what it means. Here is what needs to be acknowledged before anything else can be addressed. He said, I know. He said it the way a man said something he had been rehearsing for 900 days, had constructed in his head through many iterations, had refined and revised in the private hours of the search, had believed he had prepared adequately for, and discovered. In the actual saying of it to the actual person it was directed at, that preparation was not the same as readiness. The two words were insufficient, and he knew they were insufficient, and he said them anyway because they were the truest thing he had available in that moment. And he had learned, in the process of looking for her, that truth delivered plainly was worth more than eloquence delivered strategically. She received the two words without visible reaction. She was not waiting for more. She had not come to the cliff to receive an apology. She said, I did not come back because you found me. He said, I know that. She said, I came back because I am ready. Because I spent last night reading the Sovereign's Covenant, and I know what the mark means, and I know what the covenant requires of the mark bearer, and I am prepared to do what it requires. She said, for the kingdom, not for you. She said the last 4 words without hostility. They were simply accurate, and she valued accuracy. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. And he deserved to know the exact nature of the decision she had made. He said, what does ready mean specifically? She said, it means I am going to the capital. It means I am going to present the constitutional claim under the covenant's own provisions. It means I am going to do what the founding sovereign's framework requires of the person who carries the mark, which is to take responsibility for the territory and the people on it and the governance function that the founding bloodline was specifically designed to carry. She paused. She said, I need 3 days in Vedris before we go. There are communities here whose assessments I have not finished. I told them I would complete the work, and I am going to complete it. He said, I will wait. She said, I know you will. She said it not as a power demonstration, not as a deliberate assertion of the dynamic between them, which was itself something they had not yet fully negotiated. She said it as an accurate observation, in the same tone she would have used to describe the water table's depth, simply true, noted without decoration. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder and turned and walked back up the grass slope toward the valley town, her movement unhurried and purposeful. The founding bloodline's mark hidden beneath the fabric at her collarbone, and the founding bloodline's land-reading gift operating through the soles of her feet with every step she took across the outer province's living ground. He stood at the cliff's edge and watched her go. Then he followed, at the distance of someone who had understood, in the previous 4 minutes. That following at whatever distance she set was not a concession but a correction, the first of many he was going to need to make, and that the correction was not only right but overdue. He had spent 2.5 years looking for her. He spent the 3 days in Vedris being educated in a way that 20 years of governance had not managed to produce, not through instruction, which she did not offer, but through observation which she permitted, and which turned out to be the more efficient teaching method for someone whose primary failure had been a deficit of attention rather than a deficit of intelligence. She finished her assessments with the unhurried completeness of someone for whom the work itself was the point rather than the completion of the work. The eastern field first, the one she had identified as the most urgent case. A large farming plot whose yield had been declining for 3 years without the community understanding why. She arrived at the field's edge in the early morning, set her bag down, and pressed both palms flat to the soil with the specific practiced movement of someone performing a skilled procedure they had done many hundreds of times. He stood at the field's boundary and watched. She was still for perhaps 2 minutes. Eyes closed, both hands in the soil. Her weight slightly forward in the stance he was coming to recognize as the land-reading position, not the stillness of someone doing nothing, but the stillness of someone receiving a great deal of information through channels that required quiet to remain open. Then she began to speak, and what she said was precise and specific in the way of a physician describing a diagnosis. An underground water channel running in a northeast direction at approximately 12 feet below the surface, offset from the field's current irrigation lines by 23 meters. accessible through a single excavation point she identified by standing up and walking directly to a specific location in the field's eastern third and pressing her heel to the ground. She described the soil's composition layer by layer, the depth at which the clay content shifted from draining to retaining, the amendment type that would correct the nitrogen deficiency she felt in the upper 18 inches. The farming family gathered around her with the specific trust of people who had seen her be right many times and had long since stopped requiring explanation for how she knew what she knew. The father took notes. The eldest daughter asked clarifying questions. Isara answered each one with the same direct, undecorated precision she brought to everything. Covan stood at the field's boundary and took notes of his own. In the margin of the administrative record he had brought with him, using the shorthand he had developed over 20 years of governance briefings, he wrote, "Water channel, 12 feet, northeast offset, 23 meters. He wrote it not because he needed the information. He was a king, he had agricultural advisors. The farming community's irrigation problem was not his to solve directly. He wrote it because writing it required him to attend to it specifically, and attending to it specifically required him to understand what he was watching. And understanding what he was watching was, he had determined, the most important thing he could do in these 3 days. The boundary dispute was the second assessment, conducted that afternoon. 2 neighboring families had contested the same 40-meter strip of land for 11 years through a series of increasingly expensive legal proceedings that had produced 3 inconclusive rulings and consumed more resources than the land in question was worth under either family's calculation. She walked the contested boundary from one end to the other with the slow deliberateness of someone reading a text rather than measuring a distance. At the boundary's midpoint she stopped and said, "The soil's composition changes here. Not at the legal boundary either family is claiming. Here." She marked the point with a stake from her bag. She said, "The original allocation was drawn along this line. Everything east of this marker is the composition documented in the Eastern family's founding land grant. Everything west is the Western family's." She said, "If you have the founding land grants, check the soil composition specifications in the appendix. They will match what I am describing." They did. She had known they would. She did not say this. The third day was the community leader, a man named Vel who was 81 years old and had been the primary voice for a village of 300 people that had not received a crown administrative visit in 11 years. He had a list. It was long and it was specific, and it represented 11 years of accumulated need that he had been maintaining with the careful persistence of someone who had not given up on the possibility that someone would eventually come and ask to hear it. Isara sat across from him in the community hall and listened to the entire list without checking how much time had passed. She asked questions. She took notes. She told him at the end which items on the list fell under the land management provisions of the founding era framework she was in the process of reinstating, and what the reinstatement process would require, and what he could expect in practical terms and on what timeline. She told him this with the specific, grounded honesty of someone who understood the difference between what the system was capable of and what it was currently delivering, and who was working to close that gap rather than to manage expectations around its permanence. Covan had sat in the back of the community hall and watched all of this. On the second evening, walking back from the eastern field to the lodging house, he had asked her how the land reading worked. Not the mechanics, he had watched the mechanics for 2 days. He meant the inner experience of it, what it felt like from the inside to receive information through contact with the ground, rather than through the conventional channels of observation and analysis. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was deciding whether a question deserved a full answer. Then she said, "It is not external perception. It is internal. The land's condition is part of my own condition, the way a person feels their own heartbeat or breath. Not something I observe from outside, but something I am in relationship with from inside." She said, "The founding sovereign's governance records describe it the same way. I read them 2 nights ago for the first time and recognized what she was describing because it is what I've been experiencing since I was 14 and attributing to sensitivity because I did not have better language for it." He said, "You had the language all along. It was in the archive." She said, It was in the archive that was deliberately suppressed 3 generations ago to prevent someone like me from accessing it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." She said, "I am not telling you this as a reproach. I am telling you so you understand the full shape of what was done and how long it was done and what it cost." She said, "Governance decisions have histories that extend past the person who makes them. Understanding those histories is part of governing well." He said, "I am beginning to understand that." She said, "Good." On the morning of the 3rd day, when the final assessment had been completed and her obligations to Vedris had been honored in full, a royal messenger arrived from the capital with dispatches for Covan. He read the first dispatch, and his expression did the controlled thing it did when he received information that confirmed something he had been concerned about. He handed it to Isara without comment. Lord Arvith, head of the court's constitutional council, had filed an emergency legal challenge against the founding bloodline claim. She read the dispatch once. She folded it precisely and handed it back. She said, "He knew before we arrived in Vedris. The challenge was filed within 48 hours of the search's success becoming known. He has been monitoring the search for longer than the search has been running." Covan said, "The challenge's legal argument." She said, "We will have time on the road." She picked up her bag. She said, "We should leave now." The capital road ran northeast through the outer provinces for 4 days of riding at a moderate pace, through the specific landscape of territory that had been designed, under the founding sovereign's framework, to be governed with attention to its actual condition, and that had been governed, for 3 generations, with attention to its administrative convenience instead. Isara felt the difference in the land as they rode, the specific quality of soil that had been managed for yield without restoration. Communities whose territory carried the emotional weight of sustained neglect. Water systems that had drifted from the founding-era design, without anyone conducting the assessments that would have identified the drift before it became damage. She did not speak all of this aloud. She noted it internally with the practical attention of someone building a working picture of what the governance restoration would need to address, and in what order. The list was long. She had known it would be long. The length of the list was not discouraging. It was simply the accurate shape of the work. And she had never found accurate shapes discouraging, only useful. Covan rode beside her. His escort followed at a distance that was technically within protective range and practically far enough behind to constitute privacy. She did not know whether he had arranged this deliberately. She thought he probably had. He began the conversation on the first afternoon, and he began it badly. He used the formal language of official acknowledgement, the specific diplomatic register of a king addressing a constitutional matter of significance. The register she recognized from the petition chamber because it was the register that treated the person being addressed as a position rather than a person. He produced perhaps 2 sentences of it before he stopped himself. She watched him stop himself. She found this more interesting than the formal language would have been. He began again. He said, "The petition document was thorough. I read it in full during the week after you left, after the researcher's report arrived, and I understood what I had done. The water rights precedent was present. The legal argument was sound. The agricultural impact documentation was more precise than most of what my official advisors produce when they are working carefully." He said, "I did not see any of this because I did not read past the summary page." She rode without adjusting her pace. He said, "I had been processing those sessions for 4 years. I had developed a rhythm that I had mistaken for efficiency. The rhythm included a set of rapid assessments from the summary information, classification, subject, relief sought, that I used to determine processing priority." He said, "I had never had a case in 4 years where the classification was determinative, which meant I had been building a bias I was entirely unaware of. Because a bias that has never produced visible evidence of itself feels identical to accurate perception." She said, "You're describing negligence." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not malice." He said, "No, not malice. Negligence with identical outcomes." She said, "Yes." The road curved north through a valley where the late afternoon light came in at a low angle across the fields. She felt the valley's water table through the horse's movement, shallower than it should be on the eastern side. The irrigation patterns pulling in the wrong direction. A fixable problem that no one had assessed because no one with the relevant capacity had come through this valley with the intention of looking. She said, I accept the account. I do not accept the apology yet. He said, what would accepting it require? She said, that is a longer conversation. She said it without cruelty and without evasion, simply accurately. The apology's acceptance required evidence of understanding that extended past the articulation of the error to the evidence of changed practice. And she had known him for 4 days, which was insufficient evidence. This was a reasonable position, and she saw no reason to soften it into something more comfortable for him to receive. He said, I understand. They rode in silence for a time. The silence had the quality of two people who were both thinking rather than waiting. Productive silence rather than uncomfortable silence. The specific quality of shared mental work conducted in proximity. He said, the constitutional challenge. Tell me what Arvatha's argument will be. She said, the challenge will argue that the founding bloodline provision requires independent verification beyond the mark itself. It will cite a procedural standard from the 43rd year of your father's reign. It will request that a constitutional council panel review the claim before any formal recognition proceeds. She said, the challenge is designed to create a verification process that Arvatha's allies control. The legal argument is secondary. The procedural delay is the point. He said, and the counter? She said, the Sovereign's Covenant's anti-amendment provision. She recited it from memory precisely, because she had read it enough times that it had become as available to her as anything she had learned through years of practice. No provision of this covenant may be altered, suspended, or superseded by any subsequent legal instrument, and any document purporting to do so is without legal force. She said, the founding sovereign wrote this provision specifically because she understood that a constitutional protection whose legitimacy depended on the approval of the power structures it was designed to govern was not a protection. It was a hostage. He said, Arvath will argue the provision is itself subject to interpretation. She said, interpretation by whom? He said, his allied judges. She said, who have a material interest in the claim's outcome. The covenant's provisions on conflicts of interest in constitutional review are explicit. Parties whose holdings are directly affected by a claim's resolution are disqualified from the review panel. She said, I found this provision in the 4th document. I did not mention it in Vedris because I wanted to understand the full legal landscape before presenting the argument. He said, when were you planning to tell me? She said, now. The camp that evening was at a river crossing. The horses rested and watered. The escort maintaining their respectful distance while Isara and Covan sat at the fire with the founding documents spread on the flat ground between them, working through the constitutional landscape with the specific collaborative quality of two people whose different tools were addressing the same problem. Her knowledge of the covenant's language, his knowledge of the court's current procedural structure. The combination was more complete than either alone. A second messenger arrived as they were breaking camp the following morning. She read the dispatch and passed it to him. The constitutional challenge had a second filer, for council members whose combined hereditary land holdings would be subject to review under the founding-era land management provisions they had been operating without reference to for 3 generations. The challenge was not purely legal. It was motivated by what the founding bloodline's active sovereignty meant for the court's existing power structure, specifically, that every hereditary land claim in the kingdom was subordinate to the covenant's management framework, and that the founding bloodline's return meant the framework was no longer dormant. She said, they have land they should not be managing the way they manage it, under the founding law. And they have known this for years. The challenge is not an argument that the claim is invalid. It is a calculation that delay is preferable to the alternative. He said, then we cannot give them the delay. She said no. She folded the dispatch. She said, how much authority does the king retain under the sovereign's covenant's framework to act on court officials without council approval? He said, executive suspension pending investigation. Single instrument, single signature, immediate effect. She said, Fenwick. He said, yes. She said, and the allied judge's disqualification argument. If we present it before the challenge is formally heard, Before Arvath has the opportunity to seat his panel, the challenge is heard by an uncompromised council. He said, "That requires arriving before the council convenes." She looked at the road ahead. The capital still 2 days out. The convening scheduled in 3 days per the first dispatch, which had since been superseded by the second. She said, "The second dispatch does not give a revised convening date." He said, "Which means Arvath has not yet moved the timeline." She said, "Or he is waiting to see how quickly we travel." He said, "Then we travel quickly." She put the dispatch in her bag, checked her horse's girth, and mounted without further discussion. He was mounted before she had settled into the saddle, which she noted as an accurate indicator of his current state of prioritization, and found she had no objection to it. The second night's camp was quieter than the first. The escort had been reduced to 4 riders by Covan's instruction, enough for security, few enough for genuine privacy, and the camp was small and functional, set in a sheltered depression off the capital road where the wind dropped and the fire held steady. Isara had spread the founding documents on the flat rock she had selected as a working surface with the same instinct she applied to agricultural assessments. Find the stable ground first, then build from it. They had been working for 2 hours. The Sovereign's Covenant's legal structure, examined in full detail rather than summary, was more sophisticated than even Isara's night of reading had allowed her to fully map. The founding sovereign had been a precise and careful legal mind, not a scholar in the academic sense, but a practitioner. Someone who had built a legal framework from direct experience of what unprotected power did to people who depended on it. Every provision had a corresponding protection. Every protection had a corresponding enforcement mechanism. Every enforcement mechanism had a corresponding provision preventing it from being captured by the same institutional power it was designed to constrain. It was, Covan said, reading the governance philosophy section for the second time that evening, the most complete piece of constitutional engineering he had encountered in 20 years of working within and around constitutional structures. She said, she built it to last without maintenance, because she understood that the people who would need it most were the people least likely to have access to the systems that maintained it. He said, she built it for people like you. She said, she built it for everyone the conventional hierarchy sorted to the bottom. She said, the founding bloodline sovereignty was not designed as a personal privilege. It was designed as a structural guarantee, a point of constitutional authority that could not be captured by the hierarchies it was meant to govern, because it existed outside those hierarchies by design. She said, the mark-bearer's authority is not greater than everyone else's because the mark-bearer is more important than everyone else. It is structurally independent because dependent authority cannot protect people from the structures it depends on. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is a different understanding of authority than anything the court's current structure operates from. She said, yes, that is precisely the point. The challenge's legal argument, examined against the Covenant's full text, collapsed on 3 separate grounds before it reached the question of the mark itself. The first collapse, the anti-amendment provision, which she had cited on the road, was itself protected by a secondary provision specifying that challenges to the anti-amendment clause's applicability were to be resolved by reference to the founding documents themselves rather than by any subsequently constituted body. Arvatha's allied judges could not rule on their own jurisdiction to rule. The Covenant specified the jurisdictional question was answered by the text, and the text was unambiguous. The second collapse, the verification standard cited in the challenge, the procedural provision from the 43rd year of Covan's father's reign, was precisely the kind of subsequent legal instrument the anti-amendment provision addressed. It had been filed, processed, and entered into the court's procedural record. It had no legal force against the Covenant. The challenge was citing a document that the Covenant had preemptively invalidated 200 years before the document was written. The third collapse, the material interest disqualification. She read the specific provision aloud. Any party whose hereditary holdings, administrative position, or financial interests would be directly affected by the resolution of a constitutional claim under this covenant is disqualified from participation in the review of that claim. The 4 council members who had filed the second challenge were disqualified from the review panel. By the simple fact of having filed the challenge, Their filing was itself evidence of material interest. Arvatha's primary support structure was built from parties the covenant specifically excluded from the relevant proceedings. Covan read the provision. He read it again. He said, he filed the challenge without understanding this provision existed. She said, or he filed it believing that no one on the opposing side would know it existed. She said, the founding-era documents have been deliberately suppressed for 3 generations. The court's constitutional scholars have been working from an incomplete record. Arvatha's calculation assumed that the person presenting the founding bloodline claim would also be working from an incomplete record. He said, he did not account for the Vedras archive. She said, he did not account for me. She said it without particular emphasis, simply accurate, simply true, the description of a miscalculation whose consequences were going to be considerable. The fire had burned down to its stable middle stage, the kind of fire that would hold for several hours without attention. And the founding documents were organized on the flat rock in the order she had determined was most useful for the capital presentation, constitutional hierarchy first, then the specific provisions addressing each anticipated challenge point, then the lineage documentation, then the mark's physical description and self-evidencing provision. Covan looked at the organized documents and then at her and said, how long have you been preparing for this? She said, since last night. She paused. She said, and since I was 14. In the sense that the land-reading gift was always the preparation, even when I did not know what I was preparing for. Every field I walked, every water table I read, every community I helped, all of it was the founding sovereign's governance function expressing itself in the only context available to it. I was practicing the role without knowing the role existed. He said, that is a significant thing to discover about yourself in a single night. She said, I have had the day to adjust. He said, are you adjusted? She was quiet for a moment with the question, genuinely quiet, not performing consideration, but actually considering. Then she said, I am not certain adjusted is the right word. I am clear. I know what the covenant requires, and I know what I am prepared to do, and I know what I am not prepared to compromise. She said, the clarity is sufficient for what comes next. He said, what are you not prepared to compromise? She said, the governance structure. The founding sovereign's framework is not a heritage claim. It is a functional system designed to produce specific outcomes for the people governed by it. I am not going to use it as leverage for personal advancement or political positioning, or the correction of personal grievances. I am going to implement it because it works, and because the people living on this land deserve governance that works, and because I have been walking their fields for 2.5 years, and I know exactly what the current system is not producing that the founding system was designed to produce. She looked at the organized documents on the flat rock, and then at the Capitol Road visible as a pale line in the darkness to the northeast. She said, the water rights petition from my village is the first case I intend to address under the restored petition protocol. Not because it is my village, because it is the oldest outstanding case in the outer province records, and because the agricultural damage has been compounding for 2.5 years, and because addressing it first demonstrates that the restored framework is not a theoretical exercise. He said, I will support that. She said, I know. She said, that is not why I am telling you. I am telling you because you should understand the order of priorities and the reasoning behind it, so that when you are asked to explain the new framework's first actions, you can explain them accurately. She said, a king who cannot explain the reasoning behind his own governance decisions is a king who does not understand his own governance decisions. He said, I am beginning to understand that distinction. She said, good. She began gathering the documents back into their protective cloth. She said, we should sleep. The road is long tomorrow, and Arvath may move the convening timeline if he receives word of our pace. He said, one more question. She looked at him across the dying fire with the direct, unmanaged regard she had stopped filtering since the cliff. She said, ask. He said, the fragment of the fate thread you mentioned, the branch point. He said, I am speaking about the founding sovereign's documentation of the mark-bearer's secondary perceptive capacities, which the covenant describes as extending beyond land reading to the reading of relational conditions. He said, what do you perceive about this? He gestured between them with the specific economy of someone indicating the total of what was present rather than any particular element of it. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That is not a question I am going to answer tonight." She picked up the documents. She said, "Sleep well." She walked to her camp blankets and lay down and looked at the stars for approximately 10 minutes before she slept, which was, she noted, a shorter adjustment period than she would have predicted. She felt the capital at 1 day's distance. This was not a metaphor. The land-reading gift operated at range in the way that certain instruments operated at range, not with the precision of direct contact. Where both hands pressed to soil gave her the water table's depth and the soil's layer-by-layer composition, and the community's emotional condition encoded in the territory's aggregate state, but with the broader, less detailed quality of long-distance reception. She felt the capital the way she felt a large storm on the horizon, not the specific features yet, but the weight of it, the presence. The specific atmospheric quality of a very large human community living on very old land that had been built for one kind of governance and had been operating under another for 3 generations. She sat at the camp's edge with both palms pressed to the ground and read what was available. The founding sovereign's infrastructure was still present beneath the capital. This was the thing she had been wondering about for the 2 days of writing, whether 3 generations of different governance had altered the physical reality of what the founding sovereign had built, or whether it was still there, dormant and intact. The way deep aquifers were still present beneath fields that had not been irrigated from them in decades. It was still there. She could feel the original water system designed beneath the city's current construction. The land management framework encoded in the soil's composition. The founding-era boundary placements still marking the territory in ways that conventional surveying had long since overlaid with different lines. The founding sovereign's work was patient. It had been waiting. The capital's population, large, complex, carrying the specific emotional weight of a community living under governance that had drifted from the principles that had built the city they inhabited. Not oppressed in the dramatic sense, not suffering the acute distress of active injustice, which felt different in the land, sharper and more concentrated, but depleted in the specific way of people whose systems were producing less than those systems were capable of producing, who had adjusted their expectations to match the reduced output, who had forgotten, or never known, what the full output felt like. She said, quietly, to the space beside her where she had known for several minutes that Covan had come to sit, "The capital is tired." He said, "Describe it." She said, "Like soil that has been farmed without rotation. Productive on the surface, the systems are functioning, the city is running, the basic structures are intact. But depleted underneath. The potential is there. The founding infrastructure is there. It is simply not being used. And the land and the people on it have adapted to the reduced version, because the reduced version has been consistent for long enough that it feels like the normal version." He was quiet for a moment, looking in the capital's direction, the faint orange glow of a large city against the dark horizon, visible now that they were close enough to see it. Then he said, "Can it be restored?" She said, "It was never destroyed." She said, "Neglect and destruction are different conditions. Destruction requires different remediation. Neglect requires recommencement, finding where the original systems are still present and restarting them rather than rebuilding from nothing." She said, "The founding sovereign built everything to last without active maintenance precisely because she understood that the people with the capacity to maintain it would not always be in positions to do so. The systems are patient." He said, "Like you." She looked at him. She said, "I have been patient because I did not have better options. Patience that is chosen is different from patience that is imposed." She said, "I intend to work quickly." He said, "What do you want?" He said it with the specific care of someone who had learned, over the previous several days, that the question had a different quality when it was genuinely asked rather than asked as a preamble to something else. He said, "Not what the covenant requires. Not what the kingdom needs. What do you specifically want?" She looked at the capital's distant glow. She was quiet for a long enough time that a less patient person would have offered a prompt. He did not offer a prompt. She said, "I want the land to be what it was designed to be." She said, "The founding sovereign built a governance system whose primary function was the accurate assessment of the territory's condition and the translation of that assessment into decisions that serve the people living on it. Not decisions that serve the court's convenience. Not decisions that serve the hereditary hierarchy's preferences. Decisions that serve the land and the people on it. She said, I have been doing this informally for 2.5 years in the outer provinces because it was the only way the founding bloodline's function could express itself in the context available to it. I want to do it formally, with the legal structure that makes it durable rather than dependent on one person's continued presence in a given location. He said, that is a different kind of governance than anything the court currently practices. She said, yes, that is the point. She said, the court currently practices governance as the management of existing hierarchies. The founding sovereign's model practiced governance as the service of the territory. These are not compatible systems running in parallel. Replacing one with the other requires changing what governance is for. He said, will you let me be part of it? She looked at him with the direct regard she had stopped filtering since the cliff, the full, unmanaged quality of attention that she had been told her whole life was too much, too direct, too uncomfortable for social ease, and which she had stopped apologizing for approximately 3 days ago. She said, that depends on whether you understand the difference between serving and ruling. He said, tell me. She said, ruling is the exercise of authority for the purpose of maintaining the authority. Serving is the exercise of authority for the purpose of producing outcomes the authority exists to produce. She said, the king's role in the founding sovereign's framework is explicitly the second category. The covenant is specific about this. The executive function, military authority, diplomatic authority, administrative authority, is retained by the Alpha King not because the Alpha King's authority supersedes the founding bloodline sovereignty, but because the founding sovereign understood that certain governance functions required a different kind of organizational capacity than land reading and territorial assessment provided. She said, you serve the framework. You do not supersede it. He said, I know. He said, I have read the covenant every night for 2 years. He said, I know exactly where the king's authority fits and what it is for. She said, why every night for 2 years? He said, because I needed to understand it accurately. Because the alternative to understanding it accurately was arriving at this moment without the comprehension the moment required. He said, and because the alternative to understanding it accurately was treating it as a political obstacle rather than a governance framework, which is what I would have done 2.5 years ago, and which would have been wrong for the same reason everything else I did 2.5 years ago was wrong. Not because it was malicious, but because it was not attending to what was actually there. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pressed both palms harder to the ground, and her expression shifted, the specific focused. Shift of the land-reading gift receiving something unexpected. She said, there are people moving toward this camp from the northwest. They are organized, and they have been approaching for approximately 20 minutes. She said, they are not your escort. Your escort is northeast, on the roadside. These are coming from the valley's western approach. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, moving toward the escort's position with the decisive efficiency of someone who had managed security situations before and did not require additional information before beginning to act. She remained seated for 3 more seconds with both palms on the ground, reading the approaching group's trajectory and number and the specific quality of their movement, organized, purposeful, not panicked. The movement of people executing planned instructions rather than responding to events. She said to his retreating back, 12. Moving to encircle rather than to confront directly. They have specific instructions about an objective. He stopped and turned. He said, you. She said, most probably. She stood and picked up the founding documents from the ground beside her, secured them in their protective cloth, and put them in her bag with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 2.5 years knowing that staying ready to move was not paranoia, but accurate risk assessment. She said, shall we address this? He was already moving. She followed, with the specific unhurried purposefulness of someone who had understood, for the past 3 days, that the people who wanted to prevent her from arriving at the capital were operating from a calculation that significantly underestimated what she had spent 2.5 years becoming. The escort engaged the approaching group at the camp's northwestern perimeter with the controlled efficiency of trained palace guard encountering a numerically inferior force, 12 men against Covan's 8, in a terrain configuration that favored the defenders. With Covan's immediate declaration of identity complicating the approaching group's instructions in ways their briefing had evidently not prepared them for. The encounter was not violent in the detailed sense. It was dangerous in the sense of a situation that held multiple possible outcomes and resolved toward the safer ones through the specific combination of the escort's training, Covan's authority, and the approaching group's discovery that the circumstances they had been briefed on did not match the circumstances they had arrived at. They had been briefed, apparently, on a traveling party in which the woman they were targeting was a secondary figure. They had arrived at a camp in which the woman they were targeting had identified them by land reading 20 minutes before their arrival and was standing beside the king with the specific, self-possessed composure of someone who had been expecting them and had opinions about their instructions. The group's leader, a compact, careful man whose organizational quality suggested professional rather than political experience, made the correct assessment within approximately 90 seconds and directed his people to stand down. Covan's escort secured them with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before under different circumstances and adapted readily. The correspondence they were carrying was reviewed. The primary instructions were written in the administrative language of someone who had constructed them to be plausibly deniable while being operationally specific. Delay the woman traveling with the king's party, confiscate any documents she was carrying. Ensure she did not arrive in the capital before the Constitutional Council convened in 3 days. The language of delay rather than harm. The language of someone who wanted a procedural outcome rather than a physical one, who understood that arriving before the council convened was the critical variable and had calculated that preventing it was worth the considerable risk of intercepting the king's traveling party. Isara read the instructions once. She said, "He is not trying to suppress the claim permanently. He knows he cannot suppress the claim permanently. The covenant's language is too clear. He is trying to control the conditions under which it is heard." She said, "A 3-day delay allows him to seat his panel, process his challenge under his chosen procedural framework, and produce a finding that creates sufficient legal ambiguity to require extended review. Not a victory, a delay long enough to reshape the landscape." Covan said, "He has already filed the challenge. The panel seating is the next step." She said, "Yes." She said, "The disqualification provision prevents his panel from having jurisdiction. But the provision only operates if it is invoked before the panel is formally constituted. Once the panel is constituted and the challenge is formally assigned to it, the procedural argument becomes more complicated." She said, "Not impossible. The covenant's provisions supersede procedural precedent explicitly, but more complicated. And complexity is what he is purchasing with the delay." He said, "How much time do we have?" She said, "We are 2 days from the capital. The convening is in 3 days. We have sufficient time if nothing else changes." She said, "But this group was sent before we were aware of the timeline pressure, which means Arvith had already decided on the interception strategy before he knew whether the timeline required it. He sent them as insurance." She said, "The existence of insurance tells you something about how confident he is in his primary strategy." Covan said, "He is not confident." She said, "He is afraid." There is a difference between legal maneuvering from a position of strength and legal maneuvering from a position of managed panic. The interception attempt is the second category. The correspondence contained a second document, sealed separately from the primary instructions, which the escort had extracted from the group leader's personal correspondence rather than his mission materials. It had been addressed to Arvith and was being carried back as a report, a progress report, drafted before the interception attempt had concluded, which meant it had been pre-prepared for either outcome. The content was a status update on the Constitutional Council preparation, written in a shorthand that required some interpretation, but was sufficiently clear for its general meaning to be accessible. The shorthand referenced, in 3 separate places, a prior arrangement described only as the long-standing matter. The arrangement involved a court official whose role in the capital's administrative structure placed him in the Constitutional Records Division, the division responsible for maintaining the archive of founding-era documents that had been deliberately obscured 3 generations ago. She read this section twice. She said, "The suppression of the founding documents was not a one-time act 3 generations ago. It has been maintained, actively maintained, by someone in the Constitutional Records Division as a standing administrative arrangement." She said, "The long-standing matter is the ongoing suppression. It has been managed as institutional practice rather than historical event." Covan said, "For how long?" She said, "The shorthand does not give a timeline, but the language treats it as established, something the correspondent expects Arvith to recognize without explanation, which means it has been in place long enough to be understood as background rather than recent development." She folded the second document and put it in her bag with the founding documents. The group leader was being secured for transport to the capital by 2 of the escort members, who would deliver him and the rest of the group to the palace guard for processing. He had said nothing useful beyond his physical compliance with the escort's instructions. She looked at him as he was led past and felt, through the camp's ground, the specific quality of a person who had been given operational instructions without full context, someone who knew the what of his assignment without knowing the why, which was how professional agents were typically used when the why was something the employer preferred to contain. She said to Covan, the official in the Constitutional Records Division. He said, "I do not know who it is yet." She said, "The correspondence gives enough to narrow it. Constitutional Records Division, sufficient seniority to maintain a standing arrangement. Familiar enough with Arvith to correspond in established shorthand." She said, "Cross-referenced with the council membership list and the administrative records, it should be identifiable." He said, "I have the administrative records in the travel correspondence." He moved toward his bags. She said, "Not tonight." She said, "Tonight we need to move the camp northeast and increase the escort's watch rotation. There may be a second group with different instructions, deployed against the possibility that the first group's approach was identified." She said, "The person who plans carefully enough to send insurance plans carefully enough to insure the insurance." He stopped. He looked at her. He said, "You thought of this before I did." She said, "I have been managing risks of this kind for 2.5 years. She said, "You have been managing a kingdom. These are different skills and the current situation requires both." She said, "I will tell you what I see about our security. You deploy the response. That is the division of function the Covenant's framework describes." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then move the camp." She picked up her bag. She walked northeast along the road toward the camp's new position, reading the ground as she went, feeling the territory's condition in the darkness with both the land reading gifts direct input through her feet and the broader range reading that gave her the surrounding landscape's general state. The night was quiet in all directions except the northwest, where the first group's disruption was still visible as a disturbance in the territory's ambient condition. She walked on. Behind her, she heard him directing the escort's reorganization with the specific efficient authority of someone who had received a clear organizational framework and was implementing it without the friction of uncertainty about his role. This was new. She noted it as an accurate data point. Then a third document was found in the secured group's materials, not in the leader's correspondence, but in the kit of the youngest member of the group, folded very small, carrying a different seal than the others. The escort member who found it brought it to Covan. He read it. He was silent for a moment with a specific quality of silence. He said, "Isara." She turned. He said, "The name of the official maintaining the long-standing matter in the Constitutional Records Division." He said, "It is in this document." She crossed back to him and read it over his arm. The name was Lord Fenwick, who had been Covan's chief legal advisor for 8 years and had been his father's chief legal advisor for 11 years before that, who had reviewed every constitutional matter that had crossed the king's desk for 19 years, who had been present at the researchers' report briefing 2.5 years ago when the founding bloodline documentation had first surfaced, and who had said, at that briefing, that the matter required careful handling. She had taken that phrase, at the time, as a description of constitutional sensitivity. She understood now what careful handling had meant. She said, he knew from the first briefing. The search itself has been monitored from inside your court from the moment it began. Covan said nothing for a moment. Then he said very quietly, every security measure I took to protect the search. Every route change. Every decision about which provinces to prioritize. She said he knew. She said it with the contained precision of someone delivering accurate information and allowing the person receiving it to process it without interference. She said, this also explains how the interception group knew our route and our camp position. They were not tracking us from outside. They were receiving updates from inside. He said, I will suspend him tonight. By written instrument, immediate effect, transmitted through the escort's fastest rider. She said, yes. She said, do it now before we move the camp. The instrument needs to be in the capital before dawn, so it is processed before Fenwick can take any action to complicate the panel seating. He was already writing. She stood in the camp's darkness with both palms pressed to the ground and read the territory's condition in all directions and found it quiet, and stayed very still and waited. They moved the camp northeast by 40 minutes travel and set the new watch rotation and did not sleep for the remainder of that night, which left them tired in the specific functional way of people who had chosen wakefulness for reasons that justified the cost. The founding documents were spread on the flat rock of the new camp's working surface by midnight. The administrative records Covan had carried in his travel correspondence were spread beside them. They worked through both by lamplight until the eastern horizon showed the first thin gray of approaching dawn. What they found, working together with the methodical thoroughness that 2 days of collaborative investigation had made efficient, was not a single act of suppression but a system. The suppression of the founding bloodline's documentary record had been initiated 3 generations ago by the succession disputes winning faction. This was what the founding texts had described and what Isara had read in the Vedris archive. What the founding texts had not described, because they predated it, was what had happened afterward. The suppression had not been a one-time act of archival manipulation, followed by natural historical obscuration. It had been maintained as institutional practice, passed from administrator to administrator through the Constitutional Records Division, with the specific continuity of an arrangement whose original purpose had been understood by fewer and fewer people over time, but whose operational continuation had been preserved because the people maintaining it had been told it was important and had not been told why. Fenwick had been told why. The third document's contents, cross-referenced with the administrative records, showed that Fenwick had received a full briefing on the suppression's original purpose from his predecessor in the chief legal advisor role, a briefing that included the constitutional implications of the founding bloodline's potential resurfacing and the specific steps required to prevent those implications from becoming active. Fenwick had maintained the arrangement for 19 years not out of ignorance, but out of full understanding of what he was maintaining and why. The why was the land management provisions. Isara read through the relevant section of the administrative records twice, and then sat back from the flat rock and looked at the pre-dawn sky for a moment. She said, the 5 council members whose holdings are subject to review under the founding era land management provisions. She said, their combined territory represents approximately 1/3 of the kingdom's productive agricultural land. She said, under the founding sovereign's framework, that land is subject to specific sustainability requirements, restoration periods, yield limits, soil management standards that their current practices do not meet. She said, the financial difference between managing land under the founding era standards and managing it under current practices is, for those 5 holdings combined, substantial enough to constitute a material threat to their economic position. Covan said, how substantial? She said, I am estimating from the administrative records production figures and the founding era standards documented requirements. The estimate is imprecise, but the order of magnitude is significant enough that 3 generations of chief legal advisors maintained a standing suppression arrangement to prevent a constitutional provision from becoming active rather than simply adjusting their land management practices to comply with it. He said, they chose 19 years of active constitutional suppression over sustainable land management. She said, they chose the approach whose costs were less immediately visible. That is a consistent pattern in governance failures. She said, The immediate cost of unsustainable land management is invisible at the level of the individual holding. You get the yield this season, the depletion happens slowly. By the time the damage is significant enough to be visible, it has accumulated across enough time that no single decision can be identified as the cause. Whereas the immediate cost of complying with the founding era standards is visible immediately, reduced yield, required restoration periods, management changes. She said, people consistently underestimate gradual costs and overestimate immediate ones. That is why systems that protect against gradual costs require external enforcement rather than individual compliance. He said, which is what the Sovereign's Covenant was designed to provide. She said, yes. She said, and which is why suppressing it was worth 19 years of maintenance to the people whose interests it constrained. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I did not know about Fenwick. He said it the way he had said it about the suppression, about the interception, about every component of this that had been operating in the architecture of his own court without his awareness, with the specific honesty of someone who was not attempting to reduce their responsibility through the claim of ignorance, but was stating an accurate fact that required stating before the conversation could proceed accurately. She said, I know you did not know. She said, that is one of the things the suppression accomplished. The arrangement was not designed to deceive you specifically. It was designed to remain below the threshold of what any given king would have sufficient reason to investigate. She said, it worked because you were not given a reason to look. He said, you are describing a system that maintained itself by ensuring no one with the authority to dismantle it ever had enough information to know it existed. She said, yes. She said, this is what successful institutional suppression looks like. It does not require active deception of powerful people. It requires preventing powerful people from accumulating the specific combination of information and motivation that would lead them to look in the right direction. He said, and what provided the combination? She said, you. Your search provided it. She said, the search created a situation in which someone outside the suppression's maintenance system, me, had both the motivation to find the founding documents and the access to an archive that the maintenance system had not controlled. She said, the Vedris Archive's restricted collection was not part of the capital's constitutional records infrastructure. The arrangement that maintained the suppression in the capital had no mechanism for managing provincial archives with founding-era holdings. She said, I found what I found because I was looking in a place the system had not thought to cover, and because I had the land-reading gift sensitivity to tell me what I was looking at when I found it. Covan said, and because a neighbor submitted your name to the mating ceremony for 12 silver crowns, which put you in the capital, which produced 30 seconds in a petition chamber, which sent you into 2.5 years of movement through the outer provinces, which placed you in Vedris. She said, yes. She said it with the specific quality of someone acknowledging a chain of causation that was simultaneously absurd and entirely accurate. He said, if I had read the petition properly. She said, if you had read the petition properly, the water rights case would have been resolved. My village's agricultural capacity would have been restored, and I would have returned home and continued doing land assessments without ever going near a provincial archive with founding-era holdings. And the Sovereign's Covenant would have remained dormant for another generation while the land management provisions continued to be violated. He said, the kingdom's constitutional restoration depended on your petition being dismissed. She said, the kingdom's constitutional restoration depended on the specific combination of your failure of attention and my response to it producing circumstances that neither of us could have planned for. She said, I am not making an argument that the dismissal was correct. I am making an observation that systems produce outcomes that their designers did not anticipate, and that this is true of failing systems as well as functioning ones. He said, what do we tell the court? She said, the truth. She said, the complete truth, documented accurately, entered into permanent record, accessible to anyone who needs to understand how the constitutional situation arrived at its current state. She said, one of the founding sovereigns' documented governance principles was that the record of how decisions were made was as important as the decisions themselves, because future governance depended on understanding the patterns that had produced past outcomes. He said, that will damage reputations. She said, yes. She said, accurate records frequently do. The dawn was fully arrived now, the sky pale and clear. The capital's distant glow absorbed into the morning light. She pressed both palms to the ground one more time, the full morning reading. The founding bloodline's gift, receiving the territory's current condition in the detail that direct contact produced. The capital's land was the same as it had been the night before, tired, depleted underneath, patient. Waiting for the founding infrastructure to be used again. She said, we should ride. She said, Fenwick's suspension instrument reached the capital 2 hours ago. By the time we arrive, the panel seating will be in disorder, and Arvith will be constructing a response to circumstances he did not anticipate. He said, is that an advantage? She said, it means he will be responding rather than acting. She said, yes. She packed the documents, mounted, and turned her horse northeast on the capital road. The morning light came in across the outer provinces, and the land read clear in all directions. The specific quality of a system that was still present and still patient, and was about to be used for the purpose it had been built for. The capital's gates received them at mid-morning. Isara had been reading the city's land condition for the final hour of the approach, the range reading sharpening into something more precise as the distance closed. The founding sovereign's infrastructure becoming more detailed and more specific in her perception with every kilometer they covered. By the time the city's outer districts were visible ahead of them, she could feel the original water system design beneath the streets with something approaching the clarity she got from direct ground contact. The founding-era settlement boundaries still encoded in the soil's composition below the current construction. The land management zones the founding sovereign had established 200 years ago still present as distinct territories in the ground's physical memory, even though their administrative designations had been abandoned 3 generations ago. She pressed her right hand to the mark beneath her collarbone as they passed through the outer gate. The land recognized the contact. It was not dramatic in the visible sense. There was no illumination, no sound. No event that the riders around her would have identified as significant. It was a resonance, felt rather than seen. The specific quality of a vast system becoming aware of a condition that permitted it to function as designed. She felt it move outward from the point of contact through the soil in all directions simultaneously, not activating, not transforming, simply recognizing. The founding sovereign's infrastructure had been waiting for this for 3 generations. It was patient and it was thorough, and it had been entirely undamaged by the waiting. She said quietly to Covan, who was riding at her left, the land remembers everything the founding sovereign built. It is all still there, intact. He said, can it be restarted from here? She said, it has already recognized the mark's presence. The restart is a process rather than an event. It will require the formal constitutional claim, the governance restructuring, the active resumption of the land management function. But the infrastructure is ready. She said, it was always ready. It simply needed the mark bearer to arrive. The capital streets were the specific streets of a large city in mid-morning, busy, purposeful. The ordinary texture of urban life continuing without awareness of the constitutional significance of the travelers passing through it. She observed the streets with the landreader's perception. The communities living on the founding sovereign's territory. Their collective condition encoded in the territory they inhabited. The specific quality she had described to Covan the night before, productive on the surface, depleted underneath, adapted to a reduced version of what the land was designed to support. This would change. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in a single event. Gradually, systematically. Through the restoration of the governance function the founding sovereign's framework had been designed to produce. She had been thinking about the timeline and the order of operations for 2 days of riding, and had a working plan whose first 3 steps she could describe with reasonable specificity, and whose subsequent steps would require the land assessments that the founding-era governance model specified as the basis for all substantive decisions. The Constitutional Council chamber was in the palace's administrative wing. They arrived to find the gallery full, court officials, administrative staff. The specific audience that gathered when something significant was understood to be happening without the full shape of it having been officially announced. Arvith and his council members were seated at the chamber's formal table. The allied judges were not in their designated positions. Fenwick's suspension had created the procedural disruption she had anticipated, and the judge's disqualification argument. Delivered by Covan's legal representative the moment the suspension instrument was processed, had been sufficient to prevent the panel from being formally constituted. Arvath looked at her when she entered. She looked back at him with the direct, unmanaged regard she had stopped filtering. He had the specific expression of someone whose primary strategy had failed and who was processing the failure while simultaneously constructing a secondary approach. She read nothing from this beyond the general shape of it. She did not have the land-reading gift's precision in human emotional assessment. Only the ordinary perceptual accuracy of someone who had spent 23 years paying careful attention to what people's faces and bodies communicated. She did not bow to the council. She had considered this decision and had made it deliberately, not as a challenge, not as a performance of the constitutional authority she was about to claim, but as an accurate physical expression of the relationship between the Constitutional Council and the founding bloodline's sovereign claim. The covenant was specific. The founding bloodline's mark-bearer was not subject to the court's procedural deference requirements. She was not declining to bow out of contempt for the council. She was declining because the covenant specified that she did not bow, and she intended to follow the covenant's specifications precisely and consistently from this moment forward. She stood in the chamber's center. The gallery was completely silent in the way galleries went silent when an audience understood that what was about to happen was the thing the day had been building toward. Arvath opened the session with the secondary strategy. He produced a document from the council table's surface, not the challenge they had been preparing for, not the procedural argument, but something different. He said, "The Constitutional Council presents, for formal entry into the record, evidence of an amendment to the sovereign's covenant filed in the 43rd year of the previous king's reign, revising the founding bloodline provision to require independent verification of any sovereignty claim before formal recognition proceeds." He placed the document on the table with the deliberateness of someone playing what they believed was a strong hand. She looked at it from the chamber's center. She said, "I would like to see the document." He said, "It will be entered into the formal record for all parties' review." She said, "I would like to see it now." The specific quality of her voice in that sentence, not raised, not aggressive, simply entirely certain that the request would be complied with, produced a brief silence in the chamber before the clerk carried the document to her. She read it. It took approximately 40 seconds. She said, "This document bears a filing notation dated in the 43rd year of the previous king's reign." She said, "The filing notation format used in the 43rd year of the previous king's reign was revised in the 41st year. The format used in this document is the pre-revision format." She said, "This document was produced using an outdated template. It was not filed in the 43rd year. It was produced more recently by someone who used the wrong template." The chamber was very quiet. Arvath said, "The filing format variation is a clerical matter. The document's substance is not affected." She said, "The document's substance is affected by the sovereign's covenant's anti-amendment provision, which specifies that no subsequent legal instrument may alter the covenant's provisions, regardless of when it was filed." She said, "The anti-amendment provision has been in force since the covenant's establishment. The document you have produced, regardless of its actual filing date, cannot have legal force against the covenant's own language." She read the provision aloud. "No provision of this covenant may be altered, suspended, or superseded by any subsequent legal instrument, and any document purporting to do so is without legal force." She set the document down on the table with the same deliberateness with which Arvath had placed it. She said, "I am ready to present the constitutional claim." The constitutional claim had 3 components. She had organized them in the order the covenant specified: lineage documentation first, physical mark second, land acknowledgement third, because the covenant's self-evidencing provision was explicit that the claim's elements were to be presented in this sequence. And she had decided before entering the chamber that she would follow the covenant's specifications with complete fidelity. Not because the specifications were ceremonially important, but because precise adherence to the founding sovereign's own process was the clearest possible demonstration that the process was being honored rather than performed. The lineage documentation took 12 minutes. She presented the founding texts from the Vedras archive, the lineage records tracing 4 generations from the founding bloodline's last formally acknowledged heir to the present, the provincial records documenting each generational link, and the specific genealogical analysis she had conducted during the night reading that connected every documented record in the chain. The court recorder entered each document into the formal record as she presented it. The chamber's gallery watched with the specific quality of attention that an audience gave to something they understood was being done properly, not the performative attention of spectacle, but the engaged attention of people witnessing a process whose careful execution mattered. Arvith raised 3 objections during the lineage presentation. Each one was addressed by the Covenant's own provisions, which she cited specifically and completely. Reading the relevant language from the founding text rather than paraphrasing it, the founding sovereign's voice in the chamber, delivered 200 years after it had written the words, by the person it had been writing toward without knowing her name or her generation or the specific circumstances that would make the words necessary. The first objection: the chain of documentation had a 3-generation gap where the deliberate suppression had obscured the records. She said, the Covenant's provisions for disrupted lineage documentation are explicit. She read the relevant section. In cases where documentary evidence has been interrupted by administrative action taken against the bloodline's interests, the surviving documentation preceding and following the interruption is sufficient to establish continuity, provided the physical mark is present and consistent with the founding documentation's description. She said, the interruption in this case was the deliberate archival suppression, whose evidence she had already entered into the record as supporting documentation. The surviving records on both sides of the interruption were present and consistent. The second objection: the provincial records were not capital authenticated. She said, the Covenant specifies that founding bloodline lineage documentation requires no capital authentication. She read the provision. She said, this provision exists because the founding sovereign understood that capital authentication could be withheld by the same institutional structures whose authority the founding bloodline's sovereignty constrained. The third objection: the genealogical analysis had been conducted by the claimant herself rather than by an independent researcher. She said, the Covenant's self-evidencing provision specifies that the mark bearer is the authoritative source for the claim's documentation. She read the provision. She said, this is not a procedural accommodation. It is a constitutional design choice. The founding sovereign understood that an independent verification requirement created a verification process that hostile parties could control. The Covenant was designed to prevent that control. Arvith had no fourth objection. The chamber was quiet with the quality of a room that had watched 3 consecutive arguments fail to dislodge something and was adjusting its understanding of the morning's likely conclusion. The physical mark was the second component. She said, the Sovereign's Covenant's second element requires presentation of the founding bloodline's sovereignty mark for the chamber's record. She said, the mark is self-evidencing under the Covenant's provisions. No witness is required beyond the land it governs, which I will address in the third element. She unfastened the covering at her collarbone. The mark was exactly as the founding documents described it. She had known this, had pressed her fingers to it many times in the previous 3 days and understood with the specific certainty of direct knowledge that it matched the description precisely. But knowing it and watching the chamber's response to it being visible were different experiences. The gallery produced a sound, not a gasp, nothing dramatic, but the specific low collective breath of a large group of people simultaneously receiving confirmation of something they had been told to doubt. Several people in the gallery had brought copies of the founding documents, distributed by Covan's legal representative the day before as part of the constitutional record filing. She could see them looking from the documents to the mark and back with the methodical attention of people checking a description against a reality and finding they matched. The court recorder entered the mark's presentation into the formal record by written description, following the Covenant's specified protocol. Covan stepped forward. He had been standing at the chamber's side wall throughout the presentation, not on the throne, not at the council table, at the side wall, which was the position the Covenant specified for the Alpha King during the formal constitutional claim process. The covenant was explicit that the Alpha King's presence during the claim was as a witness and an executive supporter rather than as a principal or an authority. He had read this provision and had positioned himself accordingly without being asked to, which she had noted when she entered the chamber and had assessed as an accurate data point. He formally suspended Lord Arvith from Constitutional Council duties pending investigation by written instrument, executed with the executive authority the covenant assigned to the Alpha King for exactly this kind of court management function. He suspended the 4 council members whose challenge filing had established their material interest and their disqualification simultaneously. He entered Lord Fenwick's suspension, already processed, into the chamber's formal record. He did all of this with the specific efficient authority of someone who understood precisely what their function was in the current proceeding and was executing it without exceeding it. The remaining Constitutional Council members, for individuals whose positions were uncompromised by material interest in the claim's outcome, looked at each other briefly. Then they looked at Isara. Then they looked at the founding documents on the table, several of which were open to the provisions she had cited, and at the court recorder's formal record, and at the mark still visible at her collarbone. The chamber waited. The land acknowledgement was the third component. She said, "The Sovereign's Covenant's third element requires acknowledgement by the land the founding bloodline governs." She said, "The covenant specifies that this acknowledgement is not symbolic but physical, the land's response to the mark-bearer's presence, recorded by witnesses as part of the constitutional claim's formal documentation." She pressed both palms flat to the stone floor of the Constitutional Council chamber. The floor was ancient. The Constitutional Chamber was one of the palace's oldest structures, built on founding-era foundations, the stone laid in the first generation of the kingdom's formal existence. She felt the founding sovereign's infrastructure immediately and completely, closer to direct ground contact than any reading she had done since arriving in the capital. The original land management design visible to her perception with the clarity of something pressed directly against her hands. She read what the land showed her and spoke it aloud. She described the founding sovereign's original water system, still intact beneath the city's current construction, running in the specific configuration the founding texts had documented, and which no current administrative record preserved because the administrative records had been maintained from a framework that had stopped consulting the founding-era design 3 generations ago. She described the soil composition beneath the chamber itself, matching the founding text's documentation precisely. She described the founding bloodline's specific resonance in the land's condition. The recognition she had felt at the gate intensified now to something that everyone in the chamber could receive through the stone floor's transmission. The founding sovereign's infrastructure responding to the mark-bearer's formal claim with the specific warmth of a system recognizing the condition of its own function. The gallery felt it through their feet. The 4 uncompromised council members felt it through theirs. The chamber's ancient stonework showed, briefly, in the grain of the stone around her hands. The same star and circle pattern of the founding sovereign's seal, illuminated from within the stone itself, present for perhaps 20 seconds. Visible to everyone in the room who was looking at the floor rather than at the ceiling or at each other. It faded. The chamber was completely silent. She withdrew her hands from the floor and stood. She covered the mark. She looked at the 4 remaining council members with the direct, unmanaged regard she had stopped filtering. She said, "The Sovereign's Covenant's 3 components have been presented. The claim is formally complete under the Covenant's own provisions." The senior remaining council member looked at the court recorder. He said, "Enter the formal recognition into the permanent record." The court recorder's pen moved. The formal recognition took 4 minutes to enter into the permanent record. For minutes during which the chamber maintained the specific silence of a room that has witnessed something it does not have an existing framework to process and is conducting the cognitive work of building one. She stood in the chamber's center during those 4 minutes with the specific stillness she had developed over 23 years of learning to occupy spaces that had not been designed for her, without requiring those spaces to accommodate her. She was not performing patience. She was simply present, which had always been the most accurate description of what she was doing in any given moment, and which had taken her 23 years to understand was not a liability. The court recorder completed the entry and read it aloud for the chamber's formal record. The language was the Covenant's own, the founding sovereign's specifications for the recognition's official form. 200 years old and entirely precise, as applicable now as the day they had been written. The chamber heard its kingdom's constitution speak in the voice of its founding sovereign for the first time in 3 generations. When the reading was complete, there was a moment, perhaps 5 seconds, in which no one in the chamber spoke or moved. Then the gallery began to reorganize itself with the specific quality of a large group of people shifting from observation to response. The individual reactions moving through the assembled court officials in patterns she could read as clearly as she read the land's condition. The officials who were processing the recognition's implications for their own positions. The ones who were processing it in terms of the kingdom's broader governance landscape. The ones who were processing it primarily in terms of what they were going to say about it when they returned to their respective offices, and the colleagues who had not been present asked what had happened. She was aware of all of this and found none of it immediately relevant. The recognition was in the permanent record. The Covenant's provisions were active. What happened next was the work. Covan addressed the chamber. She had not asked him to prepare an address. She had not, in the planning they had conducted over 2 days of travel, allocated time or content to the question of what he would say to the court in the recognition's immediate aftermath. She had assumed he would say something. The Alpha King's address to the court following a significant constitutional event was a procedural expectation, but she had not specified what it should contain because she had decided that what he chose to say in this specific moment, without her guidance or her influence, was the most accurate available information about what he understood and what he was prepared to do with that understanding. She listened. He said, "The Sovereign's Covenant has been active law in this kingdom since its founding, and it has been maintained as active law through every constitutional amendment, every political change, every succession in the 2 centuries since the founding sovereign set her seal to it." He said, the Covenant was not dormant. It was suppressed. There is a significant legal and moral difference between the 2 conditions, and the record of that suppression, which has been formally entered into this chamber's permanent documentation this morning, will be available for full public review. He said, the founding bloodline's heir has been present in this kingdom for the entirety of her 23 years of life. He said, she presented a petition to this court 2.5 years ago, in this administrative system, on behalf of her village's water rights. The petition was dismissed on the summary page without the substantive review the petition's quality warranted and the petitioner's situation required. He said, this dismissal was not the founding bloodline suppression system's doing. It was my error. The error was not malicious. It was negligent. Negligence with identical outcomes. The chamber was very quiet. He said, the petition will be among the first cases reviewed under the restored governance framework. He said, this is not symbolic. It is the specific, concrete, first practical action of a restored constitutional system, chosen because it is the oldest outstanding case in the Outer Province records, and because the agricultural damage has been compounding for 2.5 years, and because addressing it first demonstrates that the restored framework is not a theoretical exercise. He said, the Alpha King's role in the founding sovereign's governance model is executive function in service of the constitutional framework. Not authority superseding the framework. Not authority parallel to the framework. Executive function in service of it. Deployed to produce the outcomes the framework was designed to produce. He said, I am prepared to serve in that capacity. He said, I have been preparing to serve in that capacity for 2 years and 7 months. Which is how long it took me to find the person who made that preparation necessary, and whose arrival in this chamber this morning represents the restoration of a constitutional system whose absence has cost this kingdom more than the permanent record will be able to fully document. He stopped. The chamber processed this. She had been standing in the chamber's center throughout the address. Listening with the quality of attention she brought to everything that required accurate assessment. She had registered every component of what he said against the framework she had been building over the previous days, the evidence of understanding, the specific language, The absence of qualification or diplomatic softening in the parts that most required directness. She had been conducting the longer conversation about the apology that she had told him on the Capitol Road would take longer than the road provided. She had sufficient evidence now. She said, "I would like to address the chamber." The court recorder noted the request. There was no procedural objection. The covenant's recognition had just been formally entered into the permanent record, and the covenant was explicit about the mark-bearer's right to address any court assembly at will. She said, "The governance restoration begins today, not as a theoretical framework, but as a working practice." She said, "The first formal session under the restored constitutional structure will be convened in 3 days, which allows sufficient time for the administrative preparation the covenant's process specifications require." She said, "The session's agenda will include the water rights case, the land management provisions activation schedule, and the petition reform protocol." She said, "The founding sovereign built this kingdom's constitutional system to serve the land and the people living on it, not to serve the court, not to serve the hereditary hierarchy." She said, "The founding sovereign's governance records document her understanding that a system serving the court rather than the people was a system already failing in the specific way that gradual failures failed, invisibly across time, with the damage accumulating below the threshold of visible crisis until the crisis arrived." She said, "The visible crisis has arrived. The constitutional record entered this morning documents its shape and its history with complete accuracy." She said, "The restoration does not require dismantling what exists. It requires reorienting what exists toward what it was designed to produce." She said, "The people on this land have been receiving a reduced version of what this land was designed to support for 3 generations. The restoration's measure of success is not constitutional formality. It is the land's condition and the people's condition, assessed by the founding sovereign's methods, improving toward what the founding design specified." She said, "That is the work." She said, "It begins now." She looked at the permanent record entry. She looked at the chamber's gallery, the court officials, the administrative staff, the specific assembled audience of a kingdom's institutional structure on the morning it had been restored to its founding principles. She said, "I would like to begin." The first formal session under the restored sovereign's covenant was convened 3 days after the constitutional recognition, in the council chamber that had been cleared of the administrative paraphernalia of the previous governance structure and furnished according to the founding sovereign's documented session specifications, a round table rather than the hierarchical long table, equal seating for all participants. The session record maintained by 2 recorders rather than 1 to ensure accuracy through cross-reference. Isara had specified the round table. She had done this not as a symbolic gesture. She was not interested in symbolic gestures, which she found consumed energy that was more productively applied to substantive decisions, but because the founding sovereign's session records documented that hierarchical seating produced hierarchical reasoning, and hierarchical reasoning consistently underweight the perspectives of the people least able to assert their priority in a status-ordered environment, which were consistently the perspectives the founding sovereign's governance model most required. The round table was a practical tool for producing better decisions. She wanted better decisions. The session's agenda had been circulated to all participants 2 days prior, which was itself a departure from the previous governance model's practice of distributing agendas on the session morning. She had specified the advanced distribution because informed participants made better contributions, and better contributions produced better outcomes, and the founding sovereign's governance records documented advance agenda distribution as standard practice for exactly this reason. She had found, in her reading of the founding records, that most of the founding sovereign's procedural specifications had practical rationales that were documented explicitly in the governance philosophy records. The founding sovereign had been a thorough explainer. She had understood that a process whose reasoning was transparent was a process that participants could improve rather than simply comply with. The water rights case was the first agenda item. She presented the case herself, not because it required her personal involvement at this stage, but because it was the oldest outstanding case in the Outer Province records, and because the petition had been prepared with thoroughness and care by someone who had spent 4 months on it and 3 weeks traveling to deliver it, and deserved to have it presented with equivalent care. She read the petition's key findings into the session record. The precedent documentation, the agricultural impact quantification, the legal argument connecting the case to the Crown's intervention authority. She did not editorialize. She did not reference the circumstances of the case's previous dismissal, which was already in the permanent record and required no repetition. She presented the petition's substance with the same plain, specific precision that the petition itself had been prepared with. The session panel reviewed the case. The review took 23 minutes, which was the appropriate time for a case of this complexity and significance. The finding was unanimous. The water rights diversion violated the established precedent for Crown intervention in agricultural water allocation. The relief was ordered. The diversion infrastructure was to be removed within 40 days. The water rights restored to the village's original allocation. The responsible party assessed for the agricultural damages documented in the petition's impact quantification. The court recorder entered the finding into the permanent record. She said nothing for a moment after the entry was complete. She pressed both palms to the session table's surface, not the land-reading GIF's ground contact, but the specific human gesture of a person making contact with something real. She noted the table's solidity. She noted the finding's existence in the permanent record. She noted that 4 months of preparation and 3 weeks of travel and 2.5 years of compounding agricultural damage had just been addressed in 23 minutes by a governance session conducted according to the founding sovereign's specifications. She said, next item. The land management provisions were the second agenda item. She presented the founding sovereign specifications for the land management framework's activation, the sustainability requirements, the assessment protocols, the timeline for implementation across the kingdom's territorial divisions. The 5 council members whose holdings were subject to review were not present, which was the expected and procedurally correct situation, given that their suspension pending investigation prevented their participation in sessions affecting their holdings. Their positions on the governance council were temporarily filled by the territorial representatives. The founding sovereign's model specified as the land management function's primary participants. The territorial representatives were farmers, community leaders, and regional administrators from the outer provinces, people who had been managing the land the founding sovereign's framework was designed to serve for their entire professional lives, and who had never been asked to participate in the governance decisions affecting it. They sat at the round table with the specific quality of people who were aware they were in an unfamiliar institutional context and who were assessing its requirements with the practical intelligence of people accustomed to working problems out in real conditions rather than theoretical ones. She addressed them directly. She said, the founding sovereign's land management framework was designed by someone who read the land the way I read the land, and who built a governance system from what the land showed her. She said, the framework specifications are not abstract policy. They are practical instructions derived from the specific conditions of this territory's sustainable productive capacity. She said, your role in this session is to tell us what the land is actually doing and what it actually needs. She said, that is the most important information this governance structure can receive. The territorial representatives told her. For 2 hours, they told her with the specific, grounded, empirically rich detail of people who had been paying attention to the land for a long time and had never had a room in which their attention's findings were the primary input for consequential decisions. She took notes. The court recorders took notes. Covan took notes. In the shorthand margin notation, she had seen him use since the first day in Vedris, attending with the quality of attention she had been watching him develop and which was, she assessed, genuine. The petition reform was the third agenda item. She presented the founding sovereign's petition processing specifications, the panel composition requirements, the time standards, the substantive review mandate, the classification neutrality provisions specifying that a petitioner's rank, status, and classification were not inputs into the case's priority assessment. She presented these specifications without commentary, because the specifications were clear and the reasoning behind each one was documented in the founding governance records and was available to any participant who wished to consult it. The The session adopted the specifications as the governing standard for petition processing, effective immediately. She said, "The transition to the new standards will require adjustment in the administrative processing workflow." She said, "The adjustment period is estimated at 30 days, during which the current backlog will be reviewed against the new standards." She said, "Cases that would have received different treatment under the founding specifications than they received under the previous processing model will be identified and reprocessed." Covan said, "How many cases is that estimated to be?" She said, "I have not completed the review. The estimate based on the outer province records I have seen in the past 2.5 years is substantial." She said, "I will have a more precise number within 2 weeks." He said, "Whatever the number is, the reprocessing is the correct action." She said, "Yes." The session concluded 4 hours after it had begun, with 12 substantive decisions entered into the permanent record, 3 working groups established for ongoing assessment activities, and a follow-up session scheduled for 10 days hence to review the land management framework's initial implementation progress. She walked out of the council chamber into the palace's interior corridor and stood for a moment with both palms pressed to the corridor's stone wall, reading the founding sovereign's infrastructure through the palace's ancient foundation, feeling the system's condition, still patient, still intact, beginning very gradually, very incrementally, to recognize that the function it had been designed for was being resumed. Covan came to stand beside her. He said, "The water rights case." She said, "Yes." He said, "The 40-day implementation window means the restoration will be complete before the planting season." She said, "Yes." She said, "I calculated the timeline against the agricultural calendar deliberately." She said, "The founding sovereign's governance records document that governance decisions made without reference to the agricultural calendar consistently underestimated the human cost of implementation delays." She said, "A water rights restoration that arrives after the planting season is 6 months of compounding agricultural damage that the timeline could have prevented." He said, "You have been thinking about this since Vedris." She said, "I have been thinking about this since the petition was dismissed." She said it without emphasis, simply accurately, the way she stated all accurate things. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The session was conducted exactly as the founding sovereign's records specified." She said, "Yes." He said, "It was also the best governance session I have attended in 20 years of governance." She looked at him. She said, "They are not separate observations." He said, "No." He said, "They are not." 3 weeks after the constitutional recognition, they were in the territory south of the capital. The Southern Territory was the region where the land management provisions had produced the most immediately visible impact, not because the implementation was yet complete, which it was not, but because the founding sovereign's infrastructure in this area was particularly well preserved beneath the current construction. The original water system design still running in its founding era configuration. The soil management zones still physically distinct in their composition. When the land management framework's activation had reached this territory in the second week of implementation, the change in the land's condition had been detectable within days rather than weeks. She had been monitoring it through the range readings since the capital, and had come to the Southern Territory to conduct the direct assessment that would provide the baseline documentation for the restoration's ongoing evaluation. Covan had asked to accompany her. She had said yes, which she had said without qualification or condition because the yes was simply accurate. His presence in the territory assessments was useful, his note-taking was precise, and his questions about what she found were the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than trying to demonstrate understanding. These were different things, and she had been distinguishing between them since she was old enough to understand the distinction. The morning assessment began at dawn, as her assessments always did. She walked the territory's eastern section with both palms pressed to the soil at regular intervals, reading the founding-era water system's current condition, the soil composition's response to the management changes already implemented, the community's collective condition as encoded in the territory they inhabited. She spoke her findings aloud as she worked, in the specific technical language of the land reading assessment that she had been developing her own notation system for over 23 years. and that she was in the process of formalizing into the founding sovereign's documented assessment protocol. He walked beside her and took notes. Not at a distance, not in the supervisory position of someone observing a process they were responsible for overseeing. Beside her, matching her pace, his notebook open to the current page. Writing in the shorthand notation he had developed across the previous 3 weeks of accompanying her in the field with the practiced quality of someone who had decided this was the work and had committed to learning it properly. She had been watching him commit to it and had been noting the commitment's quality with the attention she brought to all things that required accurate assessment. It was not performed. It did not vary in quality based on the audience present. He was equally thorough in his note-taking when the escort was nearby and when they were working alone in a field with no one else in visible range. Performed thoroughness adjusted based on observation. Real thoroughness did not. She pressed her palms to the soil at the eastern section's midpoint and read the water systems. Current status through the direct contact that gave her the clearest available picture. The original channel was running at approximately 70% of the founding era flow rate, reduced by 3 generations of unmanaged surface changes above it, but intact and recoverable. She described this aloud. He wrote it down. She moved to the next assessment point. She said, without adjusting her pace, "I accept the apology." He looked up from the notes. She said, "The apology from the Capitol Road." He said, "I thought you said it required a longer conversation." She said, "We have been having it for 3 weeks." She said it the way she said accurate things, plainly, without preamble, delivering the conclusion of a process that had been running in the background of everything else they had done since the cliff in Vedris. She pressed her palms to the next assessment point and read the soil composition with the focused attention the reading required. She said, "The decision to accept it is not based on the constitutional recognition or the governance work or the session outcomes, although all of those are relevant evidence." She said, "It is based on what I have observed you do when no one is watching to note that you did it." He said, "What have you observed?" She said, "You take the same quality of notes when the escort is out of sight as when they are present." She said, "You asked the territorial representative from the northern farming community to repeat her account of the soil management problem, not because you had not understood it the first time, but because you wanted to make sure your understanding was accurate before writing it down." She said, "When the round table's youngest participant, the community leader from the eastern border settlement, who was 24 years old and had never been in a governance session before, said something that the 3 most senior people at the table had already said, you wrote it down anyway." She withdrew her hands from the soil and stood. She looked at him with the direct, unmanaged regard she had stopped filtering before they reached the Capitol. She said, "Those are not the actions of someone performing accountability. They are the actions of someone practicing it. The difference is that performance stops when the audience is gone and practice continues." She said, "I have been watching you practice for 3 weeks. The evidence is sufficient." He was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet that was not the absence of response, but the presence of genuine reception, the specific stillness of someone who was receiving something they had wanted for a long time and who understood that the appropriate response was to receive it accurately rather than to produce the performance of receiving it. He said, "I have been in love with you for approximately 2 years and 10 months. She looked at him. She said, "The search began 2 years and 7 months ago." He said, "The search began 3 months after I read the petition." He said, "I was in love with a woman I had dismissed without reading her petition for 3 months before I understood what I had dismissed." He said, "It was a deeply inconvenient 3 months." She said, "I see." She said it with the specific quality she reserved for accurate information that was also, in some additional register, genuinely surprising. She resumed walking toward the next assessment point. He fell into step beside her. She said, "The evidence of the land-reading gifts range includes a secondary perceptive capacity the Covenant describes as relational condition reading." She said, "I read relational conditions the way I read soil composition, through sustained proximity and attention rather than through direct contact." She said, "I have been reading the relational condition of this specific situation for 3 weeks." He said, "And?" She said, "The findings are consistent with the evidence base I described." She said, the relational condition is healthy, well managed, showing the specific indicators of a system operating according to its intended design rather than a reduced version of it. He said, that is the most technical description of mutual feeling I have ever received. She said, I am a land assessor. She said, I describe what I find in the language appropriate to the assessment type. He said, what is the assessment's practical recommendation? She stopped walking. She turned to face him with both palms pressed to the Southern Territory's soil. The founding sovereign's infrastructure running warm and present beneath her hands, the land condition clear in all directions. The founding bloodline's relationship to this territory resonating in the specific way it had resonated since the capital's gate. She said, the assessment recommends continued proximity. She said, the founding sovereign's land management model specifies that systems producing healthy outcomes under current management conditions should be maintained rather than altered. She said, the current management conditions include your presence at the assessment points and your note-taking and your questions and your practice of accountability in the absence of witnesses. She said, these are not conditions I intend to discontinue. He said, I did not earn this quickly. She said, no. She said, you did not. She said, 2 years and 10 months of preparation, 3 weeks of practice, and a complete record of consistent behavior across variable observation conditions. She said, the threshold is high because what it is the threshold for is significant. She said, I have spent 23 years understanding that what I carry is real and important and mine. She said, the person who stands beside what I carry will stand beside something significant. She said, that requires having earned it. He said, I know. He said it in the way he had said it on the cliff in Vedris, when it had meant something different than it meant now, but with the same quality of genuine reception, the same absence of performance, the same specific honesty of a man who had decided that the only register worth operating in was the accurate one. She looked at him for a long moment in the Southern Territory's morning light. The founding sovereign's infrastructure warm beneath her palms and the land condition clear, and the founding bloodline's oldest gift reading the territory with the precision of 23 years of practice and 3 weeks of understanding what it was. She said, good. She turned back to the assessment and pressed her palms to the next point and read what the land showed her, and he stood beside her and wrote it down. And the Southern Territory's founding era water system ran through the soil beneath them with the patient, thorough quality of something that had been waiting a long time to be used for what it was designed for and had finally, at last, found its conditions. The Southern Territory's water system was running at 93% of the founding era flow rate, which the assessment protocol documented as full functional restoration within the expected recovery timeline for a system that had been operating at reduced capacity for 3 generations. The founding sovereign's governance records had predicted the recovery timeline with remarkable precision. Isara had noted this in the formal assessment documentation, had cited the founding record's specific projection, and had added her own methodological note. A governance framework whose predictions remained accurate 200 years after their development was a governance framework built on principles rather than on the specific conditions of its original context. The water rights case's 40-day implementation window had produced the stream restoration before the planting season, as she had calculated. The village's agricultural capacity had recovered to its pre-diversion baseline in the first full growing year, and had exceeded that baseline in the second and third years. As the founding era land management practices applied to the territory produced the yield improvement that sustainable management produced when it replaced unsustainable management across a sufficient time horizon. The village had submitted a formal expression of gratitude to the Governance Council's permanent record. She had ensured that the expression was entered under the petition's original case number, so that the complete record, dismissal, compounding damage, restoration, recovery, existed as a single continuous document. The petition reform had addressed 412 outstanding cases in its first review cycle, of which 187 had received findings different from their original processing under the previous model. The administrative adjustment period had taken 43 days rather than the 30 she had estimated, which she had documented as a methodology revision for future transition planning. The 187 reprocess cases had been entered into the permanent record with full documentation of both the original processing and the revised finding. Because the founding sovereign's principle of transparent decision-making required that errors be visible in the record rather than corrected silently in ways that obscured the error's existence. Arvith had been prosecuted under the founding-era constitutional provisions. His land holdings had been placed in the sovereignty trust and managed under the founding-era sustainability standards. He had received, in the first full growing year under sustainable management, yields that were lower than he had been producing under unsustainable practices and higher than he had projected sustainable management would produce. Because his projections had been based on the conventional model's assumptions about sustainable management's yield implications, which consistently underestimated the compounding positive effects of soil restoration over multiple growing seasons. She had noted this in the formal assessment documentation without comment, which was itself a comment of a specific kind. The 4 council members whose challenge filing had established their disqualification had been subject to the same process. 2 of them had subsequently submitted formal petitions to the Governance Council requesting technical assistance with the transition to founding-era land management standards. She had assigned territorial assessment teams to both petitions. The assessments had been conducted. The technical assistance had been provided. This was the founding sovereign's model operating exactly as designed, not excluding people whose previous actions had been contrary to the framework's principles, but holding them to the framework's requirements and providing the same governance function to everyone living on the land regardless of their history with the framework. Fenwick had cooperated with the full investigation, had provided a complete account of the suppression's maintenance over his 19 years of involvement, and had been given a reduced administrative role in the Constitutional Records Division, specifically, the role of ensuring that the founding-era documents were properly archived, cross-referenced, and accessible to any citizen who requested access to them. She had proposed this assignment over Covan's initial objection. He had thought about it for 2 days and had come back and said she was right. She had said she knew. He had said she could occasionally be wrong about something. She had said she would let him know when that happened. The Land Stewardship Council had been established in the governance structure's 2nd year, with equal representation from farming communities, herding communities, city populations, and the outer province administrative districts. It met quarterly and produced the most consistently well-attended governance sessions in the restored framework's record, not because attendance was required, but because the sessions addressed the land's actual condition in ways that were directly relevant to the lives of the people living on it, and people consistently engaged with governance that was about something real. Lord Fenwick's full investigation account had been entered into the permanent record and was publicly accessible. The 3-generation history of the founding bloodline suppression was documented completely, its initiation, its maintenance, the administrative mechanisms used to sustain it, the costs it had produced across the territory and the population during the period of the framework's absence. She had insisted on the complete documentation over the objections of several court officials who had argued that the historical account's detail was more damaging to institutional trust than the summary version they preferred. She had said, "Institutional trust built on incomplete records is not institutional trust. It is institutional performance." The complete record was entered. The marriage had happened in the 2nd year, in the Southern Territory, in the field where she had conducted the first formal land assessment after the constitutional recognition. Not in the palace, not in the council chamber, not in any institutional space. In a field, on founding sovereign soil, with the territorial representatives from the Land Stewardship Council's founding membership as witnesses, the farmers and community leaders and regional administrators who had been the first people to sit at the round table and be asked what the land actually needed. She had pressed both palms to the soil before the ceremony and read the Southern Territory's condition one more time. She had told him what she found: the land was well. The founding-era water system running at 71% at that point in the restoration process. The soil management zones responding to the sustainability standards. The community's collective condition improving in the specific incremental way of a system receiving governance that was oriented toward its actual needs rather than toward the governance structure's convenience. She had said, "The land is well." He had said, "What does that feel like?" She had said, "Like a system doing what it was designed to do." He had said, "Yes." There were 2 children. A girl of 3 who had her father's height, already evident in the specific proportion of her limbs relative to the other children her age in the palace's family quarters. And her mother's quality of attention, the specific focused stillness that arrived when she was looking at something she wanted to understand, rather than something she simply wanted to have. She pressed both palms to the garden soil with a frequency and a purposefulness that Isara observed without comment, neither encouraging nor discouraging, allowing the gift to find its own expression in its own time in the way that the founding sovereign's records described as the appropriate approach to the founding bloodline's hereditary capacities. A boy of 1 who sat in the garden's grass and watched his sister press her palms to the soil with the patient, attentive quality of someone who was learning something important and understood that learning it required watching carefully for a long time before attempting to replicate it. On a morning in the 5th year of the Restoration, in the Southern Territory field, Isara conducted the quarterly assessment that the founding sovereign's governance model specified as the mark-bearer's primary function. Both palms to the soil, the founding bloodline's gift receiving the territory's condition in the full detail that direct contact produced. The land was well. Not fully restored, full restoration was a multi-generational process, and she was 5 years into it and had never described her expectations in terms that were not accurate, but well in the specific sense of a system that was moving in the right direction under appropriate management, whose trajectory was positive, whose founding infrastructure was active and functional, and producing the outcomes it had been designed to produce. She finished the assessment and withdrew her hands from the soil and sat in the field's morning light with the founding sovereign's mark warm at her collarbone and the founding bloodline's gift quiet and present in the way it was always quiet and present. Not urgent. Not demanding, simply there, as it had always been there, waiting for the conditions that allowed it to be what it was. Covan sat beside her. He had been present for the assessment, as he was present for all the formal assessments. Taking notes in the shorthand notation he had developed across 5 years of accompanying her in the field, and which had become sufficiently precise that the Governance Council's assessment documentation team had adopted it as the standard notation format. He closed the notebook. He did not speak immediately, which was the quality she had always valued most in his presence, the ability to share a silence that was full rather than empty, productive rather than uncomfortable, the silence of 2 people who were both present rather than both waiting. She said, "The assessment findings are consistent with the restoration timeline's projected trajectory." He said, "The land is well." She said, "Yes." He said, "What does it feel like today?" She pressed both palms to the soil one more time and felt the founding sovereign's infrastructure running warm and patient through the Southern Territory's ground. The original design present and active and oriented toward the outcomes it had been built to produce. 200 years of patient waiting resolved into 5 years of careful restoration work that was not finished and would not be finished in her lifetime and would be continued by the girl in the garden who pressed her palms to the soil and by whatever came after her. She said, "It feels like something that knows what it is and is doing what it was designed to do." She said, "It feels like the beginning of what it was always supposed to be." Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.